Bien, bonjour et bienvenue à tous.
Very well then. Hello and welcome everyone. I hope that you enjoyed the New Year's celebrities much more so than I and my family, since we're now mourning. But these are things that happen. Since we'll be talking a lot about rights in the coming weeks, please allow me to begin by giving in to one of the rare rights that still remain in our postmodern societies, that of extending my best wishes to all of you for this new year, 2011, and once again without snow. If you were asked, does it often snow where you live? We'll answer no, at least not when it's not raining. Now, 1 month ago, we continued to revisit Confucius, and we saw the outcome of the first mediation by the Jesuit missionaries, in particular in the 17th and 18th centuries. We also saw the first globalization of Confucius and his analects. We also saw how this first mediation installed lastingly the image of Confucius as a philosopher. You may think of the Jesuits' Confucius philosophers. And by extension, the idea of all Chinese intellectual thinking needed to be measured in light of the philosophical discipline as it was structured professionally and institutionally during the 19th century in Europe. And it was along these lines that the question was raised as regards what should be taken away from and preserved from their own traditions for modernist Chinese intellectuals in the first decades of the 20th century, such as Hu Shi and Feng Youlan. And it was in these same terms that the question was raised just after the Second World War, in the 50s, when a European philosopher, or a French philosopher, such as Maurice Merleau-Ponty, when this European philosopher, therefore, questions Chinese intellectual traditions by calling on Feng Youlan his Chinese counterpart. We also saw that the first mediation by the Jesuit missionaries also had a lasting effect when it comes to the translation of Confucian classics, and therefore the analects of Confucius in particular. The translations by the missionaries, even though they are no longer a monopoly of Jesuits or even Catholic missionaries after the 18th century, are still being carried out and are still authoritative until the beginning of the 20th century. Some, as we saw the last time, in the English language by James Legge, or in French by the French leg, so to speak, Séraphin Couvreur, are still in circulation today, 1 century later. And yet, it is precisely through these translations that we can see a shift from the first globalization, which took place first in Latin, to move on to the second mobilization, which took place in the English language. At the last course, we saw that the first translation of the Analects, which was not by a missionary and was widely mainstreamed, was that in English by the British sinologist Arthur Waley. The title was The Analects of Confucius. Analects being the translation of lieu in Chinese, and this is the preferred translation for English speakers in the Greek sense of a collection of chosen pieces. So this translation by Arthur Waley dates to 1938. Although it was followed by scores of other translations since then, this translation played a decisive role in the perception of Confucius amongst English-speaking intellectuals and, first of all, Americans during the post-war years. What I call the second moment of globalization of Confucius is not therefore only about something reserved for scholars, the elites, those who had access to the lingua franca of scholars, namely Latin, but a much broader distribution in modern English language, and showing an image of Confucius which was far more democratic, so to speak, from Confucius, who was a philosopher and a supreme wise man, statuified and handing down moral statements, moralizing statements. We move on to a Confucius who expresses himself in day-to-day everyday language, almost like the boy next door. And as the American poet I mentioned the last time said, Ezra Pound, in the introduction to his own translation of 1951 entitled Confucian Analects, according to Ezra Pound, the translation should seek to bring to life and to make the live man speaking present. Furthermore, this globalization takes on a much broader dimension than the first globalization, which was limited to Europe, since the second globalization truly extends around the world, thanks in particular to the English language, which becomes, as you know, as we know far too well, the new international language, driven primarily by the supremacy of the American superpower at the end of the Second World War. Now, for us, this American domination may be translated intellectually by the growing use of American readings of Confucius and his Analects as of the middle of the last century. The first American reading after the war is that by early Glessner Creel, known as H.G. Creel, who was born in 1905 in Chicago, where he had all of his university career until he died in 1994. Even today, the University of Chicago has one of the best American departments in languages and civilizations of Eastern Asia, and I think that he certainly had a decisive role to play in that. Like many of his colleagues, his counterparts who were specialists in Chinese or Japan, in England or the United States, Creel put his expertise on the Far East and on Asia Pacific to the service of the Allied intelligence, military intelligence during the Second World War. I believe I already insisted on the fact that he had a very different rapport between our American friends and China. For us, China is the otherness, exotic. For the Americans, China, especially as of the Second World War, truly became the partner in front of you, the opponent, the adversary, and then a partner subsequently. H.G. Creel wrote many works on the history of the thinking and institutions in ancient and imperial China, works that are truly recommendable. And they have the merit of being based on major, solid sinological research and at the same time within reach of a broad audience. Here too we have a style that just after the Second World War stands out as compared to the style of European and French sinology. Here we have something that is capable of reaching a very broad audience. The book that we will focus on more particularly is the one on the figure, the character Confucius, and that was published just after the Second World War. It was first entitled Confucius, the Man and the Myth. It was published in 1949, and it was immediately republished by another publisher under the title Confucius and the Chinese Way. Confucius and the Chinese Way, therefore. Published in 1949 in New York. This title, Chinese and the Chinese Way, would certainly please the current official discourse in China, because that is exactly what the official propaganda is seeking today. And we shall see at the end how this American rereading, or some of it at any rate, truly go in the direction of what is desired today in China. Now, this book, deliberately intended for the general public and published in the United States just after the war, expresses a will to make of Confucius a hero of a pacifist humanism. I quote Creel. He says the following: the Confucian proclaimed man's duty to enlist in the struggle for peace, justice, and humanity towards men. Let me translate it for you into French. Now, the portrait that Creel depicts of Confucius makes of him a sort of idealist and Don Quixote type of idealist, and his group of disciples are portrayed as the forerunners of the Knights of the Round Table looking for the Holy Grail. I quote Creel, this group of Knights of the Way, to borrow Arthur Rayleigh's felicitous phrase, was inspired by a measure of devotion, not less than that later found in chivalry. Let me translate it for you into French again.
Ce groupe était porté par un sens du dévouement non moins grand que celui qui devait plus tard caractériser la chevalerie chrétienne. Alors, quant aux idéaux politiques attribués à Confucius,
Now, as for the political ideals attributed to Confucius, according to Creel, it reminds one of a benevolent democracy. Creel speaks of the democratic sentiments of Confucius. So, I won't comment for the time being on this expression, which, of course, can be questioned. That's the least one could say. According to Creel, the Confucian political ideal is characterized as follows by, and I quote, the insistence that those who govern should be chosen not for their birth, but for their virtue and ability, and the true end of government is the welfare and the happiness of the people. Translated into French once again. So, Confucius is explicitly designated here as one of the sources of inspiration of the European democracy of enlightenment, and more specifically of American democracy. And here I quote Creel once again. Both in France and in England, the fact that China, under the impulsion of Confucianism, had long since virtually abolished hereditary aristocracy, was used as a weapon in the attack on hereditary privilege. The philosophy of Confucius played a role of some importance in the development of democratic ideals in Europe and in the background of the French Revolution. Through French thoughts, it indirectly influenced the development of democracy in America. It is of interest that Thomas Jefferson proposed as the keystone at the heart of our government an educational system that shows remarkable similarities to the Chinese examination system. The extent to which Confucianism contributed to the development of Western democracy is often forgotten. So this translates into French as follows.
La philosophie de Confucius a joué un rôle assez important dans le développement des idéaux démocratiques en Europe et dans le contexte de la Révolution française. Et à travers la pensée française, cette philosophie de Confucius a influencé indirectement le développement de la démocratie en Amérique. Il est intéressant de noter que Thomas Jefferson, donc l'un des auteurs de la Constitution américaine, proposa en guise, et là Creel cite Jefferson, donc en guise de clé de voûte de l'arche de notre gouvernement, un système éducatif montrant des ressemblances frappantes avec le système des examens chinois. On oublie trop souvent à quel point le confucianisme a contribué au développement de la démocratie occidentale. Et donc, l'avant-dernier chapitre du livre de
And therefore, the second to last chapter of Creel's book, Confucius and the Chinese Way, is entitled Confucianism and Western Democracy. And therefore, the entire second to last chapter is devoted to this link which Creel perceives between Confucianism and Western democracy. From the very outset, Creel asserts the following. The philosophy of enlightenment has some very remarkable similarities to Confucianism
avec
in French,
le confucianisme et de poursuivre since it developed during the
and he continues,
18th centuries
since it developed during the 17th and 18th centuries, and this was precisely the period at which Confucianism came to be effectively known in Europe. It has inevitably been asked whether Chinese philosophy did not suggest some of these European ideas. Into French, it translates as follows.
ce fut précisément le moment où le confucianisme devint effectivement connu en Europe, on s'est inévitablement posé la question de savoir si la philosophie chinoise n'avait pas inspiré certaines de ces idées européennes. Donc, à noter que au rang de ces idées
So, you should note
Creel semble
that amongst
considérer
these European ideas,
méritocratie
Creel seems to consider
démocratique
the meritocratic principle as a democratic principle. So that gives us an identification which, as we shall see, lead to subsequent discussions that are still going on today amongst theoreticians of Anglo-American politics, and it is now gaining ground amongst Chinese elite. The question is whether or not the fact of placing political powers in the hands of just a few, chosen for their merits and not for their rank or rank of birth, this principle, which is meritocracy, is it good for democracy insofar as it is still based on the elite? So this question is still a topical issue, and assuredly we will come back to this. For the time being, what we're looking at is this book by Creel, which clearly gives us an interpretation of Confucius and the Analects, which is extremely American, in terms of its references to the founding fathers of American democracy, such as Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and so on. But this interpretation is largely inspired, that's quite obvious for us, largely inspired by the spirits of European Enlightenment. Now, the American interpretation that we'll now review clearly breaks away from this humanist perception of European origin to turn clearly towards the resources offered by pragmatist traditions, which is specifically American, which, as we saw, played a decisive role in terms of access by major Chinese intellectuals to Western philosophy in the first half of the 20th century. Let me recall, as I said in previous weeks, that Hu Shi and Feng Youlan, who were both active in the first half of the last century, these two major Chinese intellectuals are both trained and did their doctorate at the New York's University of Columbia by John Dewey, the American pragmatist philosopher, and that was truly decisive for China to enter into the ranks of modernity in the 21st century. One title that made a mark in the 20th century is the book, a very small, a very tiny book. This small book here, as you can see, just scarcely 80 pages in large print, a book by Herbert Fingeret entitled Confucius, the Secular as Sacred. So the secular as sacred. It was published in New York in 1972. There is a translation in French since 2004 of this little book, and the title was translated into as Confucius, From the Profane to the Sacred. I must say I don't fully agree with this translation because it does not really render the meaning intended by the author, since it is indeed not about the profane but the secular, and not about moving from the profane to the sacred, but you're moving from the secular, considered as sacred, the secular as sacred. And I must also point out, for those who may be interested, that there's a translation in Italian. The title isn't quite accurate either, called Confucio, il sacro nel secolare, published in 2000 by Vicenza. The sacred in the secular, that's not it either. I think we'll really have to deal with this title very literally. So it is the secular to be considered as sacred. When published at the start of the 1970s, 40 years ago, this small book by a professional philosopher who had no training in sinology, but it was the first philosopher to take the text of the Analects seriously as a philosopher. This small book had a resounding impact and remained a source of inspiration for a whole current of American sinologists and philologists, whom I will tell you more about at present. According to the bibliographical references quoted by Herbert Fingeret, who was born in 1910, we note that what he used the most was the English translation of the Analects by James Legge and Arthur Whaley, as well as the study I just mentioned by H.G. Creel, Confucius and the Chinese Way. Creel, as a matter of fact, with a lot of fair play, so to speak, welcomed with enthusiasm Fingeret's contribution in the studies on Confucius, even though it is going in a totally different direction from his. Herbert Fingeret. And just realized I made a mistake with his date of birth. He was born not in 1910 but in 1921. I must have been thinking about something else. I apologize. So he obtained his PhD in philosophy at UCLA, the University of California, Los Angeles, in 1949, after which he taught philosophy at Santa Barbara, still in California, until he retired in 1990. Now, here, therefore, we can see the American intellectual geography. Creel is from the American Midwest, whereas Fingeret is truly a Californian, so from the West Coast. So his philosophical work took place in the traditions of American pragmatists, focusing on questions linked to human behavior, much more so than on theoretical questioning or conceptual questioning. His doctoral thesis was on the philosophical dimension of psychoanalytical therapy and how to change your lifestyle based on awareness and a new understanding of oneself. So this approach is far from a conceptual approach, but it is clearly an approach that is rooted on experience. So his subsequent works were rooted in psychoanalysis and often dealt with the notion of moral responsibility. Let me quote some of his titles. You have The Self in Transformation, published in 1963, followed by On Responsibility, published in 1967, and another title, which is important, entitled Self-Deception. Quite difficult to translate into French, actually. Self-deception, that means when you deceive yourself, when you lie to yourself, published in 1969. And thus we can see how the work on Confucius, followed by 5 major articles on the same topic between 1976 and 1991, we can see how this interest for Confucius is part of work on the moral act, moral choices, the sense of obligations, a philosophical thinking that Finkeret develops later on, integrating proposals and the thoughts on the social and legal provisions concerning criminal behavior induced by addiction, induced therefore by addiction, more particularly alcohol addiction, since he worked a lot on what he called heavy drinking. So drinking heavily, and therefore the moral consequences and legal consequences that ensue therefrom. So you can see that he's not a philosopher who is into abstract speculation, and all of a sudden he discovers an interest for Confucius. The first statements in his preface to this small book express a strong conviction in a direct style that I think it would be worthwhile to hear first in the English original. I apologize to those of you who are a bit allergic to this language, which is now, how do you call it, a sort of global imperialism. But this is really the language of a philosopher, so it's important to quote it first in the original language. So the first sentences begin as follows. When I began to read Confucius, I found him to be the prosaic and parochial moralizer. His collected sayings, the analects, seemed to me an archaic irrelevance. Later, and with increasing force, I found him a thinker with profound insight and with an imaginative vision of man, equal in his grandeur to any I know. I have become convinced that Confucius can be a teacher to us today, a major teacher, not one who merely gives us a slightly exotic perspective on the ideas already current. He tells us things not being said elsewhere, things needing to be said. He has a new lesson to teach. It reads as follows in French.
Le recueil de ces dires, les analectes, m'a paru d'un archaïsme obsolète, hors de propos. Ça, c'est en général la première impression qu'on a quand on lit les entretiens. Ça, je pense que c'est
The first feeling that you get when you read the analects is a bit like this, actually. Let me continue.
Et avec une force de conviction grandissante, j'ai découvert en lui un penseur doté d'une profonde intelligence et d'une vision imaginative de l'homme dont la grandeur vaut bien toutes celles que je connais. J'ai acquis la conviction que Confucius peut être un maître pour nous aujourd'hui, un grand maître, qui ne soit pas là simplement pour nous fournir une perspective quelque peu exotique sur des idées déjà communes. Il nous dit des choses qui n'ont pas été dites ailleurs, des choses qui ont besoin d'être dites. Il a quelque chose de nouveau à nous apprendre. Il a une nouvelle leçon à nous enseigner. Donc, Fingeret nous rappelle ensuite que...
So, Fingeret then reminds us that the translations by the missionaries, be they Catholics or Protestants, have accustomed us to viewing Confucius as another Socrates, an ethnic or pagan philosopher, as the Jesuits would say in the 17th or 18th century, whose role would be there as to act as a forerunner of Christian ethics. Although he's not a sinologist, Fingeret shows that he's aware of the existence of a specifically Chinese exegesis, which developed on the analects all throughout the imperial history, and especially since a millennium with Buddhic influence. We're thinking of the exegesis by someone I mentioned several times, Zhu Qi, which is predominant as of the 12th century. Now, according to Fingeret, whether or not the readings are of a Christian or Buddhic inspiration, they are unconsciously marked by a subjectivist and psychologizing bias, the subjective psychologistic reading of the analects. Now, the reading that he proposes is not that of a missionary, nor that of an specialist in exegesis or sinologist, but that of a philosopher. He says, ultimately, my interest is philosophical, and therefore, what counts for me is the philosophical insight in the chosen text, when it is responsibly read. It reads as follows in French. Now, Fingeret explains what he means by responsible reading. I quote, I believe that one cannot completely divorce a responsible philosophical reading of such a text from careful historical and linguistic analysis. In French, it reads as follows.
Minutieuse analyse historique et linguistique. Alors, Fingeret soulève là un problème.
Now, Fingeret raises a considerable problem here, which has been covered from every possible angle, but that cannot be solved to satisfaction today. Because, indeed, how can you see to it that a philosophical reading that can be valid in terms of its originality, how can you see to it that at the same time it can be based on a textual, rigorous analysis that is historically proven? We can see that in the case of the analects, this is a very tricky problem, and yet unavoidable, because contrarily to what Fingeret may have believed at the beginning of the 70s, the textual history of the analects are still increasingly complex and still subject to controversy and with ideological and political challenges of the utmost importance in the context of the famous return of Confucius in continental China, where we started. So I would let this question aside for the time being, because it asks for in-depth treatment, so we will come back to it, and because the authors that we're examining at present, these American authors, do not seem to consider it as an important element in their interpretation of the Analects, since they use the assumption that you can more or less read the Analects as a text that is more or less consistent and homogeneous. To come back to the book by Fingeret, what do we read just as of the first chapter? The first chapter is entitled Human Community as Holy Right. In French, it reads as follows. So, I hope that you will react as I do. Almost every word in this heading immediately jars your French or Cartesian sensitivity with a Jacobine sensitivity. So you have the word community, the social body considered as a community, in addition as a sacred right. I must say that every word here has the gift of rubbing me the wrong way. Of course, Fingeret is fully aware of the fact that he is rubbing in the wrong way in terms of the consensus set up since the Jesuits and Enlightenment of a secular Confucius, a humanist, a rationalist, or even a champion like Voltaire of the fight against religious obscuranticism and superstitions. And therefore, Fingeret is obviously aware of this. And amongst the modern contemporary advocates of this portrayal of Confucius, Fingeret mentions Arthur Waley and H.G. Creel. So they are the advocates of this Confucian humanism, as well as, and this is interesting, to some extent, Feng Yulan, whom Fingeret mentions as a Chinese humanist as well. All of these names are now becoming familiar to you. So Fingeret takes all of these people and rubs them in the wrong direction. Fingeret begins by recalling the habitual quotations in the Analects, the loci classici, you would say, typical of Confucian rationalism. So we shall see in these quotations, which we will come back to later on in other contexts. First of all, a quotation from Book 6, Section 22. A dialogue between a disciple of Confucius and the master, Hanche, Huanche. So the disciple Fencher asks the master, Chi, that's the term that we now know, translated as knowledge. Here it's about knowledge in terms of wisdom. I read in Chinese. So the master replies as follows. The canonical formula you know now. The master says, let me give you the Let me give you Fingeret's translation. Devote yourself to man's duties. Respect spiritual beings, but keep distance. It reads in French as follows.
Respecte les êtres spirituels, mais garde ta distance. Donc voilà comment Fingeret comprend donc cette phrase.
So this is how Fingeret understands this statement by Confucius, or attributed to Confucius to be more exact. What I read is as follows in Chinese. Meaning, take the moral obligation that you owe to the people or to the rest of human beings seriously, and honor or show reverence for the Gui, for the lost ancestors, and the spirits or divinities. Now, here we have the ambiguity of this particle. And yet, but at the same time, it means yenchu, meaning keep them at a distance. Doing that, rendering your duties to human beings and showing reverence to divinities while keeping them at a distance, this is what you can call wisdom. The second locus classicus, generally given to illustrate the rationalism attributed to Confucius, is a famous quotation from Book 7, Section 21. In Chinese, it reads as follows. So Fingeret understands the master never talked of prodigies, feats of strength, disorders, or spirits. So here, Fingeret's understanding is really classic. And this is a single sentence. Section 21, it's a whole section here. So you can see that it can be show an extreme laconism. It reads in as follows. The master does not speak. And here you can have all the possible combinations you could imagine. The classic understanding would be to make up these four words, four different things. This is how Fingeret understands it. Why? Meaning everything that is extraordinary, something extraordinary, very literally speaking, strange, supernatural, li, meaning what is in the realm of violence or physical strength, luan, meaning disorder, chaos. You may know the famous title of the film by Kurosawa. It has nothing to do with our course, but I take this opportunity to recommend that you should watch the fabulous film by Kurosawa. The finest adaptation I know of King Lear by Shakespeare. So Luan is disorder and chaos. It's called Ran in Japanese. And lastly, Shen, the Shen we just saw in the previous quotation, meaning the spirits or divinities. The fact that the master never speaks of anything that is not human or not a part of order or what's here and now is supposed to be an illustration of Confucius's rationalism. And lastly, you have this passage in Book 11, Section 12, where you find here too a dialogue between a disciple of Confucius and the master. It reads as follows in Chinese. Now, Qi Lo, that's the disciple. Lo, one of the most loyal and closest disciples of Confucius. So Quan, he asks him how to serve the deceased and the spirits, everything that's in the world, in the netherworld, beyond human. And the master answers in Chinese. So here, let me give you the translation by Fingeret. Until you are able to serve men, how can you serve spiritual beings? So he understands, as long as you're not able to serve men, how can you claim to serve spiritual or divine beings? So you have this opposition between the world of the human and the world of what could have been human, but which is no longer human, which is no longer in the realm of the human. The disciple asks another question in Chinese. This means the disciple takes a polite expression and says, I dare ask you, what is Xu? Now here you can understand this as death or the dead. The master replies in Chinese, which means, as long as you do not know life or the living, how can you know death or the dead? Fingeret understands, until you know about life, how can you know about death? And therefore, you have these three quotations, and I will stop here, which introduce Fingeret's message. Despite all of these quotations that apparently go in the direction of a certain skepticism or rationalism, or skepticism with respect to anything that goes beyond the human, Fingeret believes he can perceive elsewhere in the Analects the assertion of the magical power of some modes of action. And he uses the word magic or magical, and he explains what he understands by this. By magic, rest reassured, I've almost finished. By magic, I mean the power of a specific person to accomplish his will directly and effortlessly through ritual, gesture, and incantation. In French, it reads as follows. So to conclude, I wanted to conclude, in fact, by showing you the cover
couverture donc de ce petit livre auquel j'ai consacré donc la séance de
The cover of this little book, which we focused on today, and as you can see, you have the Chinese character designating a ritual or rite. It's a character with a lot of wear and tear intentionally. It was probably taken from an inscription engraved, and I'd like to conclude with an evocation of my father-in-law, Mr. Mots-clés, who's a fine calligrapher, and he did the calligraphy of the same character, a character referring to rites or rituals in ancient Chinese. Thank you for your attention, and see you next week. Thank you.